Something is showing up on trail cameras in Wisconsin. Not once, not twice. A pattern, a recurring image of an animal that has no established breeding population within roughly 1,000 miles of where the photographs are being taken. A large, tawny cat, muscular, long-tailed, unmistakable to anyone who has spent time looking at wildlife photographs. Mountain lions, puma concolor, an animal that the official record for the state of Wisconsin lists as extirpated, meaning locally extinct, since the early 20th century. If what you just heard makes you want to keep going, stay here. This is exactly the kind of content we make, and there is a lot more of it. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. An animal whose nearest confirmed breeding population sits in the Black Hills of South Dakota, closer to 400 miles away than 3. An animal that the state's wildlife agency has spent considerable institutional energy explaining is not established in Wisconsin, is not reproducing in Wisconsin, and whose occasional appearances in the state represent dispersing individuals rather than a recovering population. All of that is technically true. It is also, increasingly, beside the point. Because the cameras keep firing, the images keep coming, and the males keep arriving from somewhere out west and moving through a landscape that their species abandoned a century ago, leaving behind only the cameras to document that they were ever there. If you find this kind of story as compelling as I do, the kind that lives in the gap between what the official record says and what the trail cameras are showing, stick around and subscribe. There is a lot more where this came from. The story of mountain lions in Wisconsin is not, on its surface, a story about danger. It is not a story about attacks, about suburban encroachment, about predators recalibrating their relationship to human beings. It is something quieter, and in some ways more interesting than that. It is a story about space, about how much space a male mountain lion requires when it disperses from its birth territory, about the distances those males are willing and able to travel across a landscape that most wildlife managers would not have predicted they could navigate, about what it means when a large apex predator keeps appearing in a place where the ecological and political conditions for its permanent return have not been formally established, and yet it keeps showing up anyway, as if the animal has not received the memo about where it is and is not supposed to be. The trail cameras are not lying. The question is, what, exactly, they are telling us. And the full answer to that question requires understanding something about mountain lion dispersal biology, about the history of the species in the American Midwest, about the politics of predator recovery, and about what it would actually take for Wisconsin to host mountain lions in something more than the transient, ghost-like way it currently does. Start with the history, because the history explains why the cameras catching mountain lions in Wisconsin feel surprising to people who live there, and why that surprise is itself a kind of historical artifact. Mountain lions were not always absent from the upper Midwest. They were not always absent from Wisconsin, or from Michigan, or from Minnesota, or from Iowa, or from Illinois, or from any of the states that currently treat a mountain lion photograph as a noteworthy event rather than a routine wildlife observation. The historical range of puma concolor in North America extended from coast to coast and from southern Canada to the tip of South America. It was one of the most widely distributed land mammals in the Western Hemisphere. In North America, north of Mexico, the species occupied essentially every terrestrial habitat type available to it, from the temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest to the hardwood forests of the upper Midwest, to the pine barrens of the Southeast, to the desert scrub of the Southwest. There was no part of the contiguous United States where mountain lions were not present in the pre-Columbian landscape. The eastern subspecies, Puma concolor cougar, was as much a feature of the forests of New England and the Great Lakes as the white-tailed deer it hunted. Accounts from early European settlers in the upper Midwest describe encounters with what they called painters, catamounts, or panthers, with a regularity that suggests a population that was not sparse. It was part of the ecosystem. It was one of the things that lived here. The extirpation of mountain lions from the eastern half of North America was not a gradual process, driven by habitat loss alone, though habitat loss was a component of it. It was a deliberate, coordinated, publicly supported effort to remove large predators from the landscape. Bounty programs, in which state governments paid cash for each mountain lion killed and proof of death submitted, were widespread across the country by the mid-1800s and remained in place through the early 20th century. The logic behind them was straightforward and reflected the values of the agricultural economy that was reshaping the continent. Mountain lions killed deer, which competed with livestock for forage. Mountain lions killed livestock directly. Mountain lions were perceived as a threat to human safety. Mountain lions killed game animals that human hunters also wanted. The bounty system translated these concerns into a financial incentive that produced the intended result with extraordinary efficiency. Mountain lions were not merely hunted out of the eastern United States and the Midwest. They were systematically eradicated by a policy apparatus that was specifically designed to ensure that the eradication was complete and permanent. By 1900, mountain lions were effectively gone from every state east of the Rocky Mountains, with the exception of a small remnant population in southern Florida, the Florida panther, which would itself decline to the brink of extinction before a captive breeding and genetic rescue program stabilized it in the 1990s. In Wisconsin specifically, the last documented resident mountain lion was killed in 1908. That date is not perfectly precise because record-keeping in rural Wisconsin in the early 20th century was not designed with retrospective wildlife analysis in mind. But the general contour of the history is clear. By the time the state entered the era of modern wildlife management, mountain lions were gone, and had been gone long enough that the absence had become normalized, had become the baseline expectation against which any subsequent appearance was measured and found anomalous. The animals that are now showing up on trail cameras in the state are arriving into a landscape that has not contained a breeding population of their species in over 100 years. The forests have grown back. The deer are there. The habitat, in many respects, is more suitable than it has been at any point since the bounty era ended. But the lions were not there to take advantage of the recovery, because recovery of a large predator population does not happen passively in the way that forest recovery happens. It requires either active reintroduction or natural recolonization from an existing population. Wisconsin has had neither, officially. What it has had, with increasing regularity, is dispersers. The dispersal biology of mountain lions is the central mechanism that explains why Wisconsin keeps getting these visits and why the visits have been increasing in frequency over the past 2 decades. Mountain lions' social structure is built around a specific pattern of space use and movement that creates, as a predictable byproduct, a population of young animals moving across the landscape in search of unoccupied territory. Both male and female mountain lions disperse from their natal territories when they reach social maturity, at roughly 1.5 to 2 years of age. But the dispersal patterns are dramatically different between the sexes in ways that matter enormously for understanding range expansion. Female mountain lions typically disperse relatively short distances from their birth territories, often establishing home ranges that overlap or are adjacent to their mothers. This is not universal, but it is the dominant pattern, and it means that the northward and eastward edge of the species range moves slowly in the female dispersal mode, at rates that reflect incremental home range establishment rather than dramatic long-distance movement. Male mountain lions are a different story entirely. Young male mountain lions disperse from their natal territories in movements that can be, and frequently are, extraordinary in their extent. The documented dispersal record for the species includes movements that exceed 1,000 miles from the point of origin. These are not exceptional outliers in the statistical sense. They are a predictable expression of a biological drive that has been selected for over evolutionary time, because finding unoccupied territory in which to establish a home range requires moving until you find space that is not already claimed by a resident male. In a species where resident males occupy large territories and actively exclude competitors, the pressure on dispersing males to keep moving until they find an opening is intense. The males that have been moving to North Dakota, to Iowa, to Illinois, to Missouri, to Michigan, to Wisconsin, and to points further east in the past 2 decades are not lost. They are not confused. They are doing exactly what the biology of their species predicts they should do. They are moving through the landscape in search of territory, and the landscape they are moving through happens to cross state boundaries in ways that surprise human observers who have been trained to think of mountain lions as Western animals. The source population for the dispersers reaching Wisconsin is broadly the Western Mountain Lion Range, with the Black Hills population in South Dakota receiving particular attention from researchers studying Midwestern mountain lion occurrences. The Black Hills are significant for a specific reason. They represent the easternmost established mountain lion breeding population in the continental United States, positioned geographically between the core of the Western Range and the largely depopulated eastern half of the continent. The mountain lions of the Black Hills have been reproducing and expanding since the 1970s, when the regional shift away from bounty hunting and toward regulated management allowed the population to grow from near extirpation to a robust and expanding presence. As the Black Hills population has grown and its males have begun dispersing into surrounding terrain, those males have been the leading edge of a natural recolonization process that is moving, slowly but measurably, in an eastward direction. The states of the upper Midwest, Wisconsin included, are not at the leading edge of the Western breeding range. They are at the frontier of where that range might eventually reach, and the dispersing males arriving there are the biological scouts of that potential expansion. The trail camera record in Wisconsin is more extensive than most people outside the wildlife management community realize, and the pattern it reveals is worth examining in some detail, because it tells a story that the official communications about mountain lion presence in the state do not always tell with the same clarity. The Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources maintains a database of mountain lion reports that includes trail camera images, direct sightings, tracks, and other physical evidence, and applies a verification process intended to distinguish genuine mountain lion detections from misidentifications of bobcats, large domestic cats, or other species. The verified sightings in that database have increased substantially since the early 2000s. They are not evenly distributed across the state. They cluster in the northern third of Wisconsin, particularly in the forested areas of the Northwoods, where deer density is high, human density is low, and the habitat characteristics most closely match the conditions in which dispersing males from western source populations are most likely to persist. The northwestern counties, bordering Minnesota and therefore positioned as the most geographically proximate to both the Black Hills dispersal corridor and the established populations in the Dakotas, have the highest concentration of verified detections. But verified detections have also been recorded in the central part of the state, in the transition zone between the Northwoods and the agricultural landscape of the South, and occasionally in the South itself. What the cameras are catching is almost exclusively male animals. This is expected and is directly predicted by the dispersal biology described above. Female mountain lions from the Black Hills and other western source populations have not been documented reaching Wisconsin in any verified case in the modern record. The occasional reports that describe what looks like a female with cubs or a female in reproductive condition have not survived the verification process. What survives is the male. Over and over, on cameras placed along deer trails, creek crossings, forest edges, and logging roads across northern Wisconsin, the cameras fire, and the image that comes back is a large male mountain lion moving through the landscape with the unhurried purposefulness of an animal that knows exactly what it is doing and has not decided yet where it is going. The biological implication of this pattern is stark and important. A landscape full of dispersing males with no resident females and no breeding activity is not a recovering population. It is a population sink. The males arrive, move through, and either die, leave, or persist temporarily in a landscape that cannot, in the absence of breeding females, sustain itself. The cameras are documenting visitation, not colonization. The difference between those two things is the difference between a statistical curiosity and an ecological event, and the conditions required to cross that line have not yet been met in Wisconsin. Why haven't females followed? The answer involves geography, distance, and the fundamental asymmetry in male and female dispersal behavior described earlier. The females of the Black Hills population are reproducing, and their offspring are dispersing, but female offspring are dispersing shorter distances and are establishing territories within or adjacent to the Black Hills complex, rather than making the eastward journey across the agricultural and mixed-terrain landscape between South Dakota and Wisconsin. The landscape between the Black Hills and the forests of northern Wisconsin is not, by the standards of what a motivated male mountain lion can cross, an impassable barrier. It is several hundred miles of mixed grassland, agricultural terrain, river corridors, and scattered woodlands that a dispersing male can navigate in weeks if conditions are reasonable. For a female mountain lion, whose dispersal behavior is more conservative and whose willingness to move through open agricultural terrain is constrained by both behavioral tendencies and the practical requirements of raising young, the same landscape presents a more significant obstacle. Females need cover, security, and a prey base sufficient to sustain not just themselves, but dependent offspring. The corridor between the Black Hills and Wisconsin is passable for a male moving fast. It is more demanding for a female trying to establish a permanent home range. The corridor question has become one of the central preoccupations of researchers studying the potential for mountain lion natural recolonization of the upper Midwest, and the science being produced around it is both illuminating and sobering about the timeline. The habitat modeling work done by researchers at various universities and state agencies over the past decade consistently identifies corridors of suitable habitat connecting the Black Hills to the forests of Minnesota and Wisconsin, running through the river valleys and mixed terrain of Nebraska, South Dakota, and Minnesota. The Boundary Waters area of northern Minnesota, the vast forested region bordering Canada that already hosts wolves, black bears, and a dense population of prey, has been identified in multiple analyses as the most likely staging ground for eventual mountain lion establishment in the upper Midwest if natural recolonization from western source populations continues. Wisconsin's Northwoods sits downstream of Minnesota in this geographic logic, positioned to receive animals that have first passed through or established in the Minnesota region. The males being documented in Wisconsin today may represent a fraction of the males that are successfully making the crossing from the west, with a larger proportion dying on roads, being killed in encounters with landowners, or simply failing to persist in the corridor terrain without adequate prey and cover. Road mortality is a significant and underappreciated factor in the mountain lion dispersal story across the upper Midwest, and it deserves specific attention because it shapes not just the survival of individual animals, but the pace and probability of natural recolonization. The road network of the American Midwest is dense. Interstate highways, state highways, county roads, and rural agricultural roads create a grid of vehicle traffic that dispersing mountain lions must navigate. The animals that have been documented as confirmed mountain lion mortalities in the upper Midwest over the past 2 decades are overwhelmingly road kills. Illinois had its first confirmed mountain lion in the modern era, hit by a car near Meriden in 2008. Missouri has documented road-killed mountain lions. Iowa has documented road-killed mountain lions. The pattern is consistent and biologically meaningful. The corridor terrain that dispersing males are using to move east contains road hazards that reduce the probability of successful transit and make it very unlikely that the dispersal events represented by trail camera images in Wisconsin are converting into permanent establishment. The animals are getting there. They are not always surviving the getting there, and those that do survive are not staying because the conditions for staying, specifically the presence of females, are not met. The politics of mountain lion presence in Wisconsin and the upper Midwest represent a dimension of this story that is as important as the biology and considerably less studied. The question of whether mountain lions should be allowed to naturally recolonize Wisconsin and what management framework should govern their presence if they do is not a purely scientific question. It is a question that intersects with the interests of deer hunters, livestock producers, state wildlife agencies with limited budgets and significant existing predator management obligations related to wolves, and a public whose attitudes toward large predators are not uniform and are not determined by ecological arguments alone. The wolf recolonization of Wisconsin, which happened through natural dispersal from Minnesota and Michigan beginning in the 1970s and 1980s, and produced a breeding population that has generated sustained political conflict ever since, provides a template for what mountain lion recolonization would likely involve in terms of stakeholder dynamics, and it is not an encouraging one from the perspective of those who view large predator recovery as straightforwardly desirable. Wisconsin's wolf population, which recovered from complete extirpation to roughly 1,000 animals by the mid-2010s, has been the subject of continuous management controversy involving tribal treaty rights, livestock depredation compensation programs, state and federal listing and delisting decisions, hunting season opening and closure, and intense disagreements between the agricultural community and conservation advocates about the acceptable level of wolf presence in the state. The wolves did not ask permission to return. They followed their biology through landscapes that their ancestors had used and arrived in Wisconsin as dispersing individuals from established Minnesota populations. The state's management framework scrambled to keep up with the biology, and the political conflict generated in the process has not fully resolved decades after the animal's return. A mountain lion population, if it were to establish in Wisconsin, would arrive in a political environment already shaped by that wolf experience, in a state whose agricultural community has strong views about the tolerance limits of large predator presence, and whose wildlife agency has limited appetite for the management complexity that comes with a new apex predator in the landscape. The livestock production community in Wisconsin is not monolithic in its views about mountain lions, but the historical record of stakeholder conflict in states where mountain lions have expanded their range or density provides a reasonable predictor of what would emerge in Wisconsin if breeding populations established. Colorado, California, Washington, and Oregon have all dealt with livestock depredation conflicts as mountain lion populations have grown, and the resolution of those conflicts has almost universally involved lethal removal of problem individuals, which satisfies neither the conservation advocates who want predator populations protected nor the producers, who want a more systemic reduction in predator numbers. The existence of a Wisconsin mountain lion population, if it arrived, would require a state wildlife agency to develop and fund a depredation response program, a monitoring program, and a public communication strategy about coexistence, at a time when the agency is already managing a complex and contentious wolf program. The institutional incentive to allow natural recolonization to proceed without formal acknowledgement, to treat verified sightings as individual dispersal events rather than as the early stages of population recovery, is strong. It avoids the management obligation, defers the political conflict, and maintains the comfortable fiction that mountain lions in Wisconsin are visitors rather than potential residents. The deer hunting community in Wisconsin is the stakeholder group whose reaction to potential mountain lion establishment is the most complicated and least predictable. Wisconsin hosts one of the largest and most culturally embedded deer hunting traditions in North America. The state's approximately 600,000 licensed deer hunters generate enormous economic activity and provide the largest single source of wildlife management funding through license revenue and federal excise taxes on sporting equipment. The relationship between predator recovery and deer hunting opportunity is a genuine tension that does not dissolve through reassuring language about ecosystem function and trophic cascade effects.
Mountain lions eat deer. A mountain lion in typical mountain lion habitat consumes roughly 1 deer per week in the warm season, and somewhat less in winter.
A breeding population of mountain lions in the Northwoods of Wisconsin, if it established, would represent a meaningful additional source of deer mortality in a landscape where deer populations are already managed under pressure from both hunters seeking high-density herds and wildlife managers trying to limit chronic wasting disease spread and agricultural damage. The question of how mountain lion predation would interact with hunting, harvest, and herd management is not a question the Wildlife Agency has been required to answer yet, because there is no breeding population. But it is a question that would arrive immediately if the biology produced one, and it does not have an easy answer. The chronic wasting disease dimension is worth examining specifically because it introduces a complexity into the mountain lion debate that cuts against the simple opposition between hunters and predator advocates that most casual observers would predict. Chronic wasting disease, the prion-caused neurological illness that has spread to deer herds across most of the upper Midwest, including Wisconsin, has produced a wildlife management problem of extraordinary difficulty. The disease is transmitted partly through carcass contact and partly through environmental contamination from bodily fluids and decomposing tissue. It is fatal to affected deer and has no treatment or vaccine. It spreads with the movement of infected animals. Wisconsin wildlife managers have been struggling to contain its spread for 2 decades, with limited success. One of the theoretical tools for slowing or containing prion diseases in cervid populations is increased predator pressure, which selectively removes sick and behaviorally compromised animals that are easier to catch and that would otherwise continue moving through the landscape and contaminating new areas with shed prions. Wolves in Wisconsin have been studied in this context, and there is preliminary evidence that wolf predation may be selectively removing chronic wasting disease-positive deer at rates above what random mortality would predict. Mountain lions, which hunt by stalking and ambush and are highly sensitive to the behavioral cues that distinguish compromised from healthy prey, would theoretically be at least as effective as wolves in the selective predation of diseased deer. The irony of a wildlife management situation in which mountain lions represent a potential tool for managing a deer disease that deer hunters care deeply about is not lost on the researchers who study both species. But it has not yet produced a meaningful shift in the political dynamics of the mountain lion debate in Wisconsin, partly because the state is not required to have that debate seriously as long as breeding populations remain absent. The trail camera technology itself has changed the nature of the mountain lion documentation problem in Wisconsin and across the upper Midwest in ways that deserve acknowledgement because they affect how the science is being produced and how the public is receiving it. A generation ago, the evidentiary standard for documenting a mountain lion in Wisconsin was high. You needed a physical specimen, a track in soft substrate that could be photographed with a scale, or a sighting by a trained observer willing to submit a formal report. The high evidentiary standard filtered out most casual sightings, which are frequently misidentifications of bobcats, domestic cats, dogs, and other animals, and produced a verified record that was sparse but reliable. The proliferation of trail cameras, which now exist in the hundreds of thousands across Wisconsin's deer hunting landscape, has changed this situation dramatically. There are now cameras covering habitat in Wisconsin that would previously have gone entirely undocumented. The probability that a mountain lion moving through the state's northwoods goes undetected by a camera has declined substantially in the past decade. This means that the increase in verified mountain lion detections in the state partly reflects genuine increased frequency of mountain lion presence, and partly reflects increased detection probability for animals whose frequency of occurrence might not have changed. Distinguishing between those two contributions to the trend is methodologically difficult and has not been definitively resolved. What is clear from the trail camera record is that the detections are not random. They are clustering in specific habitat types, along specific terrain features, and in specific geographic areas in ways that reflect the movement biology of dispersing mountain lions, rather than random image artifacts. Dispersing mountain lions in wooded terrain tend to follow specific corridors, ridgelines, riparian corridors, and forest edges that provide cover and prey concentration. The trail camera images in Wisconsin cluster along these features in the northern part of the state, in a pattern that is consistent with directed movement through the landscape, rather than wandering or localized home range use. Several of the documented animals, identified as individuals by coat pattern and scar characteristics in multiple camera images, have been detected on cameras separated by distances of 20 or 30 miles over periods of weeks, providing direct evidence of the kind of long-distance travel that dispersing males undertake. The cameras are not catching the same animal over and over in a small area. They are catching different animals, and sometimes the same animal at different points in its journey through the state, in a pattern that tells a clear biological story about what these mountain lions are doing in Wisconsin. They are moving through. The question is where they are moving from, and where, if they survive, they eventually go. The death rate among dispersing mountain lions, documented in the upper Midwest, is difficult to estimate precisely, because the recovery of carcasses in the vast and often roadless terrain of the Northwoods is not systematic. Roadkills are found and reported because they occur in visible locations adjacent to traffic. Mountain lions that die of other causes in remote terrain may go entirely unrecovered and undocumented. What the roadkill record suggests is that mortality during dispersal is significant. The mountain lions documented as roadkills in Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Indiana, and other Midwestern states over the past 20 years represent a minimum estimate of the mortality occurring among animals moving through the region. The actual number of animals dying during dispersal through the Midwest, from all causes combined, is almost certainly higher. The trail camera images in Wisconsin are therefore documenting not just the mountain lions that arrive, but the survivors of a dispersal process that has already filtered out an unknown proportion of the animals that attempted the journey. The cameras are showing you the ones that made it this far. They are not showing you the ones that did not. The question of what happens next Whether the pattern of increasing male detections in Wisconsin eventually produces the conditions for breeding population establishment is one that researchers approach with more caution than popular accounts typically reflect. The optimistic scenario, from a natural recolonization perspective, involves female dispersal from the Black Hills population, eventually producing individuals that successfully navigate the corridor to Wisconsin or Minnesota, find the resident males that are already moving through those landscapes, breed, establish home ranges, and begin the process of building a resident population. This scenario is biologically plausible. It is supported by the general logic of how other large predator species have recolonized former range when source populations have grown large enough to produce sustained dispersal pressure. The wolf recolonization of the upper Midwest is the most directly relevant precedent. Wolves dispersed from Minnesota into Wisconsin and Michigan, and eventually established breeding populations in both states. Mountain lions could, in theory, do the same thing. The biological barriers to that happening are real, but not insurmountable. The pessimistic scenario involves the current pattern persisting indefinitely, with male mountain lions continuing to arrive in Wisconsin, document themselves on trail cameras, and then disappear into the uncertainty of what happens to dispersing carnivores in a fragmented landscape, without ever producing the female establishment and breeding activity that would convert the pattern from visitation to recolonization. The pessimistic scenario is supported by the observation that male-only dispersal has been occurring in the upper Midwest for at least 2 decades without producing documented breeding events, and that the corridor habitat between the Black Hills and Wisconsin remains fragmented, mortality-inducing, and inhospitable enough for females that the sex ratio of arriving animals has not shifted toward the balanced ratio that breeding populations require. The dispersal events are frequent enough to document. They are not frequent enough, and the survival rates are not high enough to produce what comes next. The possibility of assisted recolonization, meaning deliberate translocation of mountain lions into Wisconsin to supplement or accelerate natural recolonization, exists as a management option in the abstract, but faces a political landscape that makes it essentially unworkable in the near term. The translocation of wolves to Yellowstone in 1995, the most successful predator reintroduction in North American conservation history, required decades of scientific preparation, federal legal authority, and sustained political pressure that overcame enormous resistance from affected agricultural communities. A mountain lion reintroduction in Wisconsin would require a comparable political alignment of forces that does not currently exist and shows no signs of assembling itself. The state wildlife agency has not advocated for reintroduction. The state legislature has not shown interest in it. The livestock and deer hunting communities would oppose it. Conservation organizations that might advocate for it have largely focused their political capital on the wolf management controversy, which continues to require sustained attention rather than opening a new front on mountain lion reintroduction. The cameras will continue to fire. The lions will continue to arrive, and the management and political infrastructure required to convert those arrivals into something more permanent will continue to lag behind the biology. What the trail camera images reveal about the condition of the individual animals being photographed is itself informative and worth discussing in some detail, because it speaks to both the capability of these animals to make the crossing and the difficulty of sustaining themselves in the landscape once they arrive. The animals being photographed in Wisconsin are predominantly in good physical condition, as assessed by body condition, scoring from image analysis. They are not visibly emaciated. They are not injured. They are large, healthy-looking males in the prime of life who appear fully capable of hunting deer and surviving in the Wisconsin Northwoods habitat they are moving through. Some of them are probably hunting deer during their time in the state. Deer kill sites that are consistent with mountain lion predation based on the manner of kill and carcass handling have been found in areas of the state where mountain lion detections are concentrated, though the attribution of specific kill sites to mountain lions rather than other predators is not always straightforward. The point is that these are not animals that are arriving in Wisconsin in a compromised condition reflecting the difficulty of the journey. They are arriving intact and functional, which says something important about the navigability of the corridor terrain and the sufficiency of the prey base in the landscapes they are crossing. The behavioral data that can be extracted from sequences of trail camera images of the same individual over time is limited, but suggestive of some patterns worth noting. The animals being photographed in Wisconsin are predominantly moving at night, which is consistent with the crepuscular and nocturnal activity pattern typical of mountain lions in areas of high human density. Nocturnal movement in human-dominated landscapes is a behavioral adaptation that reduces encounter rates with people and is widely documented in mountain lion populations that have experience with human-dominated terrain. The fact that the animals in Wisconsin are exhibiting this pattern suggests either that they are behaviorally conditioned to avoid humans from their origin landscape, or that they have acquired the behavior during transit through areas of high human activity, or both. Either way, it reflects a level of behavioral sophistication in navigating human-modified landscapes that is consistent with what researchers have documented in mountain lion populations in the American West. These animals are not blindly charging through the landscape. They are moving with apparent awareness of risk and adjusting their activity timing accordingly. The cameras catch them mostly in the hours before dawn and after dusk, moving quickly through terrain that they do not appear to be settling into, but rather moving across. The geographic specificity of the detections within Wisconsin is more informative than the aggregate count of verified sightings in isolation. The confirmed detections in Wisconsin cluster strongly in the northwestern counties and the northern tier of the state, with a secondary cluster in the central Northwoods and isolated detections scattered further south. The northwestern clustering is consistent with the most direct dispersal corridor from Minnesota, through which animals moving east from the Black Hills or north from Nebraska and Iowa would be most likely to enter the state. The Douglas, Bayfield, Ashland, Iron, and Vilas County areas of far northern Wisconsin have the highest concentration of verified detections and represent the terrain most analogous to the habitat the animals are likely coming from. As you move south, the habitat becomes more fragmented, the agricultural matrix more dominant, and the detections correspondingly rarer. The pattern is what you would predict from the biology. Animals moving east from western source populations enter the state from the northwest, move through the Northwoods habitat that best supports them, and either exit into Michigan's Upper Peninsula to the east or turn south through central Wisconsin in a dispersal pattern that eventually either finds an edge or finds a road. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which has its own trail camera record of mountain lion detections, may be receiving some of the same animals documented in Wisconsin as they continue moving east. The Michigan connection is worth a brief examination because it extends the geographic story beyond Wisconsin and suggests that the dispersal phenomenon is not contained within any single state's borders, but is instead a regional pattern playing out across the upper Midwest as a whole. Michigan's Upper Peninsula has produced verified mountain lion detections at a rate comparable to northern Wisconsin, with a similar pattern of male-only occurrence and a similar concentration in the forested northern terrain. The Upper Peninsula's geographic position, surrounded on three sides by the Great Lakes, represents a potential terminus for eastward dispersing mountain lions that have entered Wisconsin from the northwest and continued moving. Animals that reach the eastern shore of Lake Michigan have nowhere further to go in a continental direction. They are contained by the lake. Whether they turn north, survive in the Upper Peninsula habitat, or perish in the attempt to find territory in a landscape that offers no further eastward option is not known for most individuals. The documentation is fragmented, and the fate of most individuals photographed once or twice is unknown. They appear on a camera and then do not appear again, which could mean they died, they moved on, or they are simply in an area without camera coverage. The broader regional picture, Wisconsin and Minnesota and Michigan's Upper Peninsula receiving regular visits from dispersing males that cannot convert into breeding populations in the absence of female establishment, has been described by some researchers as a population sink in the classical ecological sense, a habitat patch that attracts individuals from source populations, but does not produce successful reproduction, and therefore functions as a net drain on the regional populations. This characterization is not universally accepted because the mountain lion population in the Black Hills source area is large enough and productive enough that the loss of dispersing males to Midwestern mortality does not appear to be limiting the source population's growth. The Black Hills population is robust. It is producing surplus males. The loss of some fraction of those males to road mortality and other causes during dispersal attempts through the Midwest is regrettable from the perspective of those individual animals, but is not currently a conservation concern at the population level. The source is not being depleted by the sink. The question of whether this arithmetic changes as the source population's trajectory changes, and how it might change if natural selection begins favoring longer distance dispersal in response to competition for territory in the Black Hills, is an interesting one that has not been definitively addressed. The public response to mountain lion trail camera images in Wisconsin has followed a pattern that is recognizable to anyone who has watched how people process information about large predators returning to places where they were previously absent. The initial response to each new image is typically a mixture of excitement, skepticism, and concern, in proportions that vary by the audience. The outdoor and hunting community tends toward skepticism first, noting the long history of misidentified bobcats and domestic cats in predator photograph reports, and only accepting the image as genuine after reviewing the morphological evidence that distinguishes a mountain lion from everything else that might produce a similar image on a trail camera. Once the image passes that filter, the response within the outdoor community is often something closer to reverence than fear, a recognition of the animal's wildness and capability that coexists with a practical concern about what the animal's presence means for deer populations and livestock. The urban and suburban public, who encounter the story primarily through news coverage rather than through direct experience in the relevant terrain, tends toward the fear and wonder poles in a pattern that reflects the general dynamic of large predator stories in media. The regulatory and management community tends toward careful language, precise documentation standards, and deliberate communication that emphasizes the individual dispersal nature of the detections over any narrative of range expansion or population return. The media coverage of individual mountain lion detections in Wisconsin has been uneven in ways that shape public understanding in sometimes unfortunate directions. Stories that lead with the dramatic elements of the images, the size of the animal, its presence in unexpected terrain, the surprise of finding such an animal on a camera placed to photograph deer, tend to generate high engagement and circulation, but often fail to provide the biological and historical context that would allow readers to understand what the image actually means. Readers come away with the impression that something unusual and potentially alarming is happening without the framework to evaluate either the unusualness or the actual nature of the phenomenon. Stories that lean heavily on reassuring language from wildlife agency communications, emphasizing the individual dispersal nature of the event and the absence of breeding populations, often fail to communicate that the frequency of these events is increasing, and that the frequency increase is itself scientifically significant. The gap between what the cameras are showing and what the public understands about what the cameras are showing is significant, and is partly a product of media coverage patterns that are not specific to this issue, but affect how complex ecological stories are communicated generally. What would it actually take for Wisconsin to host a breeding mountain lion population? The question is worth answering directly because it clarifies the distance between the current situation and the outcomes that either concern or excite different constituencies, depending on their values and interests. It would require female mountain lions to successfully navigate the corridor from the Black Hills through the agricultural and mixed terrain of South Dakota, Minnesota, and northwestern Wisconsin, and arrive in the Northwoods in sufficient numbers to encounter the males that are already there and establish home ranges. It would require those females to survive in the Wisconsin landscape long enough to breed, give birth, and raise kittens to dispersal age. It would require the kittens to survive to that age in a landscape that contains other predators, vehicle traffic, and a human population with mixed attitudes toward large carnivores. It would require all of this to happen without the level of lethal conflict with human interests that typically triggers management removals sufficient to suppress the emergent population. Each of these requirements is individually achievable under favorable conditions. The probability that all of them are met simultaneously in the near term is not high. The probability that they are eventually met if the Black Hills population continues to grow and produce dispersing females, if corridor habitat is maintained and where possible restored, and if road mortality can be reduced through infrastructure and driver awareness in the most critical crossing areas, is more substantial. Natural recolonization by mountain lions in the upper Midwest is not a fantasy. It is a biological trajectory that is in motion, that the trail cameras are documenting, and that is moving toward an outcome on a timeline that is determined by ecology and geography rather than by management decision or political preference. The researchers who study this trajectory most closely are neither the optimists who see a mountain lion return to the upper Midwest as imminent and inevitable, nor the pessimists who dismiss it as biologically impossible and politically unworkable. They are, as scientists tend to be when examining a complex system, cautious about predictions, while clear about the direction of the evidence. The evidence says that dispersal events are becoming more frequent. The evidence says that the source population in the Black Hills is large, productive, and generating sustained dispersal pressure to the east. The evidence says that the corridor habitat, while fragmented and mortality-inducing, is not completely impenetrable to motivated dispersers. The evidence says that females will eventually follow the males into this landscape if the source population continues growing and if female dispersal distances expand as competition for home ranges in the core of the range intensifies. The evidence says that a breeding event in Wisconsin or Minnesota, if it occurred, would likely go undetected for some period before being documented, because kittens are secretive and the landscape is large and the camera coverage, while extensive, is not omniscient. The cameras keep firing. The images keep coming. Males from somewhere west of here, moving through a landscape that their species has not occupied in more than a century, passing through the Northwoods in the hours before dawn, and leaving behind a photographic record that the biology of dispersal predicts should exist, and the history of the species demands we interpret honestly. They are not lost. They are not aberrations. They are the biological expression of a recovering species exploring the limits of a range that was taken from it by deliberate human action and is being reclaimed by the logic of ecology in a region that has never stopped being, in terms of habitat and prey, a place where mountain lions belong. Whether Wisconsin and the states around it will allow the full expression of that recovery through active support passive tolerance, or the management neutrality that does not obstruct what it does not endorse, is a question that the trail cameras cannot answer. What they can do is document that the question is no longer hypothetical. The mountain lions are already here, not in the numbers and configurations that would constitute a population, not yet, but here, on camera, moving through the dark, going somewhere we have not yet determined, toward an outcome we have not yet decided. The next time a camera somewhere in northern Wisconsin fires and produces an image of a tawny shape moving through the timber in the hours before dawn, the image will be more than a curiosity, more than a wildlife management footnote, and more than evidence of an individual animal's extraordinary navigational capability. It will be one more frame in a longer story about space and recovery and the biology of animals that do not recognize the political boundaries we have drawn across landscapes they inhabited long before we arrived to draw them. The cameras are watching. The lions keep coming.